I'm Amos, host of Undaunted, a proud member of the Gonna Geek Network, just like the show you're listening to now. The opinions expressed are those of each individual host. Check out all the other podcasts at GonnaGeekNetwork.com and get ready, because geekiness begins in 3, 2, 1.
Let's be about it, and welcome to episode number 139 of Better Podcasting. On this show, we get technical and specific with ID3 tags.
In this week's Better Podcasting download, we give you a bit of an update about a WordPress theme that we talked about a few episodes back.
In this week's Better Podback, we talk about our hashtag failure.
And finally, we'll tell you about how we got screwed by Catbox. Lauren, start the show now. Hashtag failure.
Welcome to Better Podcasting, a show where we talk about podcast tips, tools, and best practices to help you succeed with your podcast. What makes us different? Well, just like you, we podcast purely out of the love and fun of it. Podcasting is our hobby, and we recognize that it's yours too. We always encourage your questions and feedback, and you can find all of our contact information at betterpodcasting.com. Here's your hosts for the show, Stephen John Drew and Stargate Pioneer.
Welcome to episode 139 of Better Podcasting. I am Stephen John Drew, and with me, of course, is my podcast husband, Stargate Pioneer.
And as your podcast husband, I have to inform you that I am drinking out of a brand new Better Podcasting mug tonight. First use, first time it's being used.
Wow. And by the way, you can buy these at Nowhere. Use promo code NOTHING. So go ahead and check that out now at nothing.nothing. So there you go. But let's talk about how I could have saved my podcast story. For those of you who aren't familiar with this, we have this section that we like to do, ideally called How I Saved My Podcast. We encourage you to send us your stories where something went wrong with your podcast, and you tell us how you fixed your podcast. So then we can go ahead and talk about how you saved your podcast on here. But in lieu of that, when we don't have a story, we like to talk about how we could have saved somebody's podcast, and we like to find a problem and talk about some ways to possibly have fixed this.
That's right. So about a month ago, actually 2 weeks ago, on the podcasting subreddit, there was a call for help from one young lady, and her post name was Podcast of 3 People, 1 isn't contributing. So here goes the post. Quote, title pretty much sums it up, but for a little bit more detail, we've been doing a podcast with 2 of my friends, K and A. K and I view the podcast as our passion project. It's something we love doing, and it's fun, and we genuinely care about it. A seems not to give a frack. She was super on board when she started, but now that we're focusing on meeting once a week, she hems and haws. Also, it's a podcast about dating stories. Me and K have a plethora of those, but A doesn't have any. We thought this would be okay because she'd contribute in other ways, but she hasn't. Of the stories she does have, A is awful at storytelling. She just isn't a good speaker. So what do you do when you have one person who's dragging everyone else down? Or because we've started, do we just have to deal with a crappy host? So that was the post. And I would think that the number one advice I would give anybody in this situation is, if you can back up to the beginning, I would definitely write down expectations of what you expect your co-host to have. Now, we talked before on ownership on this issue, who owns what, and money issues. But if you have performance issues or suspect that you're going to have performance issues, you should write down those expectations too. Like you are going to have to do this. Now, we did this on Starling Tribune when we brought Michelle on board. It was a whole long contract. It was a joke, but it was an actual contract. And we basically told her what her responsibilities were going to be. So I think that's a good idea. That is, if you can back up to the beginning and actually write those down, write down that contract, write down those expectations. Now, if you're in the middle of everything and you're stuck with this, my advice would be, well, you're just going to have a meeting with her. You're just going to have to sit her down and say, hey, look, these are our expectations. You're not living up to them. You're dragging the podcast down. We want to continue this podcast. and we need you to step up your game to do what you originally had envisioned to do. And if not, we need to move on without you. And if it continues, then you got to go ahead and move ahead without her and fire her. But if you can work through it, then that's probably the benefit for all three people. So, Stephen, what do you think?
Yeah, definitely having the expectations up front makes a big difference. The other thing that I will say is once you're in this situation, no matter whether you've got the expectations up front or not, it's a hard conversation to have. I've had this conversation with people before, and it's very, very tough to do. Hopefully, the initial conversation goes well enough that they realize, okay, I really do have to step up. But the earliest that you can get to this, the better, because otherwise if you let it go on for years, then they go, but I haven't done anything different for the last couple of years. Like, why does it matter? I've been the same person week after week. So if you can get in there a little bit sooner, then at least they know the expectations, and they might themselves say, well, okay, this is just not for me. And I'll be honest, they might say that not so nicely. They might have a couple of 4-letter words in there when they have this, and they might prefer to storm off. But it is worth having this conversation early on. It's really tough, though, when you do have friends involved.
It is. Now, there was a lot of great advice that was given in the comments. There were some that I wouldn't say is great advice, but if you pick if you're publishing this in a public place, you're going to have to sift through some of the advice and see what's going to work for you and your situation. Anyway, I went back today and I posted, hey, how did everything go? And she replied, we're still exploring it, but she's a lot better. Hope it holds up. So obviously that they've had that conversation and they're moving forward. So congratulations. Hopefully that'll be a how I saved my podcast story in the future. But
I saw your post, SP, and I changed my ways. It was on me, right?
Thank gosh.
Yeah.
Don't have to fire you again in 2018.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and move on to ID3 tags. Hey, it's time for us to get technical this week. In the past, we've talked about various things with ID3 tags. We've talked about ways that you can make ID3 tagging easier for yourself. We've talked about how certain media hosts will automatically encode ID3 tags. And we've even had our show stolen from us, just like it was literally taken out of our hands so that some other people who took over the show could loosely speak about different parts of ID3 tags. But we've never done a specific breakdown of ID3 tags commonly used by the podcast community. Now, did we say commonly used? Yes, we did say that because that's kind of vague, and we'll explain more about why we're a little vague in a minute here. But before we get there, let's answer the question, what are ID3 tags? So, yes, we've talked a little bit before about how ID3 tags work, and I'll let SP talk about them.
Okay, so we recognize that everyone can only take Stephen in moderation. So there's a high probability you haven't heard those episodes that we talked about it before. So the ID3 tags are essentially fields, and basically you can think of it in terms of text boxes that you're going to fill out. And they're embedded into the MP3 audio file with information about your podcast that can be read by podcast players. So we know you're saying, but I thought podcast apps just read from your RSS feed. Well, yeah, often podcast apps actually do this. However, there are some audio players that read the ID3 information from within the MP3 file itself. You see, ID3 tags actually predate podcasting. So in 1996, there was a fellow who was named Eric Kemp, and he had the idea to add a small chunk of data to the audio file. Now, this was known as the ID3. Now we call it the ID3 V1 because it was version 1. And it was the foundation for ways to store data such as music. So you had the artist, track name, track information, etc. Now, this is when the era of CDs were coming into really common use. So when podcasting came along and adopted the MP3 format as the main way to get podcasts, then podcasters had to use this ID3 tag creatively, which is why we're about to explain some common ways to use those fields.
So what exactly are we doing today in the episode? Well, yes, we're going to go through and explain individually some of the common notable areas that notable podcasts do fill out. But what we're going to also do is talk about what areas specific podcasts have done, because again, it's not all level playing field when it comes to ID3 tags. Different podcasts choose to fill out different boxes. So we want to give you the knowledge and the tools so that you can make the decision on which ID3 tags you think are most valuable for yourself. So let's start off by talking a little bit about how ID3 tags are broken out. There's essentially 4 main blocks of ID3 tags. There's the main ID3 tag block. There's the extended ID3 tags. There's the cover art or embedded art, whatever you want to call it, as well as the lyrics section. These are all kind of different umbrellas within the ID3 tag. Now, the main ID3 tags that are often used by podcasters, again, we're talking about the often used ones because there's a whole bunch of other ID3 tags that we're not going to talk about because they're not relevant for podcasters, are starting off with the track. The track's actually broken up into 2 different sort of fields. You've got the first / the second, or the first of the second. So like on an album, if you had a amazing SP's Bebop Hits album, he's probably going to have 2 songs because he's so busy podcasting, he could probably only put together 2 songs. So it would be track 1 of 2 or track 2 of 2. With podcasters, often we just leave that second one blank and only use the first one, so that it's often the episode number. Unless, of course, it's a predetermined series where you know that you're going to have like a 40 episode series and you're like, this is 1 of 40. That's kind of the only real main footnote to how people might use that second block.
Well, the second block can also be used to denote the disc number. Say you have a 2 disc set or a 4 disc set or a 12 disc set. You can do track 1 of disc 1. So that could be used that way as well. So 2 different ways that it could be used. Now, the next ID3 tag that we're going to talk about is the title. Now, this is usually the title of the episode that you are publishing. Some people include the name of the podcast, and some start with the episode number, and some leave the episode number out. I actually prefer to put the episode number at the end of the title personally, but in the title, in the MP3, I usually put the podcast name in there. So as it scrolls across the screen, in case it does, you have the podcast name first and then the episode name. So that is what I would concern with the title. Now, the artist for podcasting is usually the owner of the podcast. Sometimes it can be a company. Oftentimes, especially for hobby podcasters, it's an individual. You can also put a network name in there if you were trying to go for network notoriety and a little bit of SEO. But usually, especially with Gonna Geek, we encourage everybody to own their own property. So the producer should put their own name in that block.
Now, there's another one called the album block. The album block is usually the full name of the podcast. And so what you might see is, like, for example, the album would say Steven's Paint Drying Podcast versus the artist that would say Stargate Pioneer, because he would own Steven's Paint Drying Podcast, of course. So that's sort of the bit of the difference that you would have there. Now, there's also, we talked about the artist, we talked about the album. Why not have an album artist field? That's right. There is an album artist field, and regularly you see common practice. This is the same as the artist. So again, the owner, or, you know, just if you want to give your property to Stargate Pioneer, just put his name in there. That's what I personally recommend.
Contractually, you have to for this podcast. Yeah. There's also a year ID3 tag. And once again, this is in the main block of the ID3 tags. The year, and we usually see this as the year that the podcast episode was released, not necessarily the year that the podcast started, but the year that the episode itself was released. So I would go with that. Now, the next tag is genre, and some people put the theme of their podcast, but generally this should be quote unquote podcast. Now, a little note here. This is different from the iTunes categories, which I've noted that some people get confused over. genre is in the ID3 tag and category is in the RSS feed. So a lot of people that are podcasters about podcasting say, don't put podcasts in the RSS feed because that is not, unless you're podcasting about podcasting, don't put podcast as the category. Well, that's true for the categories, but for the genre, go ahead and put podcast because you're not a country and western, you're not a TV film, you're not anything like that. You are a podcast. So for the genre, go ahead and put podcasts.
And let me give a bit of an idea of where this might be really annoying if you don't do this. Let's say that this file of yours ends up in an audio player, not a podcast player, but an audio player that is amongst other songs that somebody has on their device. Well, when they pull up that audio player, do they want to sort by genre? Yes, they probably, if they're listening to music, working out, and they want to be listening to music and not podcasts, they might want to filter out that podcast category, which is why you really, really do those listeners a benefit of making sure to put podcast in there so then it is properly categorized in audio players. There's also a section in the main block called comment. The comment is often used as a brief description of the podcast. It's a great idea to use this as a section to put your URL in there because it's really the only long form field that is within the main ID3 tag blocks. It's also a good idea for other contact information like call-in number or voicemail because it is the only long-term field or long form field that you can put quite a few different characters in there and it doesn't seem weird. So you can put like line breaks and stuff too. So absolutely, I would suggest using this for that purpose as well as, of course, the brief description.
Now, the last tag in the main block is called the composer. Now, this in podcasting is often the same as the artist or album artist. However, some podcasts will actually put their editor or producer or main production person there if it's different from the podcast owner. So you can put the creative force behind the podcast in the composer tag. So that rounds out the main ID3 tag umbrella or block, as we've been calling them. Now, the next block is the extended ID3 tags, and the extended ID3 tags start with a block called, or a tag called subtitle. Now, this could be used as the slogan of the podcast or the tagline of the podcast. So go ahead and put the subtitle, and it could also be the subtitle, the same subtitle that you use as part of your RSS feed. So like for Starling Tribune, it's the official Arrow podcast of the GonnaGeek.com network and the rest of the DC universe. I don't have it right in front of me, but that's basically what it is. Now, the next tag in the extended block is the copyright. Now, this is the year that the company would own the intellectual rights. Always tag your episode with a copyright. And then also update, if you put the year in here, also update that every year. Just don't copy it over for a new episode in the next calendar year. This is very important because this is your ownership of that intellectual property. Unless you've distributed your podcast through a host, let's say like Anchor, who claims to own all of your podcasts. So there's that. Now, the next tag along the line is the URL. Now, this is the URL for your podcast. I would go ahead and put it in there. And then there's a tag called encoded by. And this is one that there seems not to be any consistency or pattern at all. So some use this as just another field for the name and or the URL of the podcast. Some use this as the editor, but I don't think that this is a stopping point for anybody that wants to use it for something else either. Now, the next block or umbrella, as Stephen called it, were the lyrics. Now, the lyrics has two main tags. One is the lyricist, and with podcasting, this is usually blank. And then the next lyrics one is called lyrics. And then I often use this, and most podcasters often use this as a complete description for your individual episode. So this is like all of your show notes. If you just copy and paste, I will warn you that there is no HTML formatting or anything. It is simply a text portion of your show notes. So if you have some cute formatting in there, even bulletized or anything, that won't show up. It'll just show up as a continual block of notes. And I have heard in the past, by the way, of people using that lyrics block if they have lost their website and they don't have their show notes at all, and they've lost their common storage area like Google Docs or whatever. They have gone back to the lyrics and they've helped within the MP3 file itself. They've downloaded the MP3 file from their host and they've used that lyrics block to actually recreate their website. So it's a very much far reach for a backup, but it's there nonetheless. And if somebody finds the ID3 tag in the or the MP3 file in the far future, they can download the show notes from there if they have an ID3 tag editor.
So those are some of the main sections in the ID3 tags. Now let's go through and walk through briefly some of the notable podcasts that we thought we would mention on how they use ID3 tags. Because again, lots of different information used, and we want to give you the tools to help make that decision. Let's start off with one that we are happy to always recommend. The company is called Libsyn. Libsyn is a company that we quite like, and we've found is a very reliable host, and they have an official podcast called The Feed. So let's take a look at how Libsyn's The Feed ends up tagging their files, because they are the official podcast of Libsyn. So you can bet they know what they're doing. Well, I pulled up 3 random episodes, 112, 119, 123. 119 and 123 followed the following information, and we'll come back to 112 in a second. The way that they did it was with the track section, they left that blank. The title had the episode number at the start, and then it said the title. So it actually had the full title of the individual podcast episode. The artist said Libsyn The Feed Podcast with Elsie Escobar and Rob Walsh. The album said The Feed, the official Libsyn podcast, pipe, which is that little line, podcast strategy, pipe, podcasting tips, pipe, media hosting. And then the album artist was the exact same as artist, as we previously talked about lots of people doing. The year was left blank. The genre was said podcast. The comment had basically the episode details in quite length, and the composer was blank. Now, the extended, we would walk you through line by line, but there was actually no extended information filled out, so no subtitle, copyright, URL, or encoded by. The lyrics were also blank, and the embedded cover information in there was a 102 kilobyte file, or kilobyte file, I should say, and the dimensions were a 1400 by 1400 file. And there's actually a title block that is tied to that album art, and it said Array. So clearly it's the Midas Array from Voyager, Star Trek Voyager. So they are actually podcasting from the Delta Quadrant.
You know, with Rob on that podcast, I wouldn't doubt that at all. He is a Star Trek fan.
So that's how Libsyn's The Feed do it. Now, the summary of this is that they focus mostly on the main titles, and they leave the extended information blank. Also, I have a feeling this is automatically generated from the Libsyn site, just based off of... I pulled some other random podcasts, and there was a lot of similarities, including that quote array. And I think that might be encoded right from the Libsyn site. Now, 112, however, it was either broken or not properly filled out. Basically, it just said a bunch of random numbers under some weird information, including the encoded said iTunes 12.7.2.58. Now, the reason I'm mentioning that is because sometimes podcasters get down on themselves when they realize, oh, I forgot to tag an episode. Don't worry. It happens to everybody, and this is a great example. On Libsyn's The Feed made an error. That was just a random number that I pulled to, and it happened to not be tagged. So it happens. Don't stress. It's not the end of the world. Just send SP an email and tell him that you need him to hold you.
You can always re-encode the file and then upload a replacement with the same file name, and that should work fine. And other podcast catchers that actually upload and suck up your podcast episode, they might not get the new tags, but everybody else will. So it'll be there for the long term. That's good. Now, the next podcast that you took a look at was actually a podcast called your podcast, and it's made by another podcast service company called Blueberry, right?
Yes, it is. Now, the reason why I wanted to look at this one here is because Your Podcast is Blueberry's official podcast, and it's also hosted on powerpresspodcast.com, and there's a few different shows that are tied in there, but that's where it is. And the way that they did things was they had the track number filled out on the ID3 tag. So like episode 25 had 104, episode 30 of Your Podcast had 113, and episode 35 had 122. I'm confused. I don't really understand the numbering behind that. I think it might be to do with multiple shows in the feed. I'm not sure. But they had it filled out, and it was very confusing to me, and would be probably confusing to me if I was downloading Your Podcast and depending on the ID3 tags. But that's how they did it, so we'll mention it. The title was the name of the show first, followed by YP and then the number. So like, for example, Your Podcast 25 said more company mergers and be nice! Dash YP25. YP 30 or Your Podcast 30 said Google's new podcasting strategy dash YP 30, and so forth. The artist was left blank. The album said Power Press Podcast, and the album artist was also left blank. So hey, the album artist and the artist, again, similarity there. It's used the same way. Year was 2018. The genre said podcast, and the comment and the composer were also left blank. They had in the extended information one more piece of details than Libsyn's The Feed had, which was the copyright. It had a C in brackets, and then it said Blueberry. So they actually had that written in there. The rest of the fields were blank. So were lyrics. From a cover / album art perspective, they had a 127 kilobyte file that was 1400 by 1400 pixels. And there was a title, though. The title said Power Press Podcast. So those guys at Blueberry, they're just suckers on Earth like the rest of us. They're not in the Delta Quadrant. No.
No. So of note, the copyright did not include the date. It was just copyright Blueberry. There was no 2018 on there. So there was another field in there called www audio file.
Yeah, I was the only one that I had seen. And actually, Tag Scanner that I use, Tag Scanner actually didn't show that in the field, but when I actually went and I looked at the specific encoded like raw data, there was this www audio file that said powerpresspodcast.com. So it's obviously a non-standard field, but it is something that they wrote in there, and I don't know how that's written in, but I guess data is data. You can probably shove all sorts of things into data. So the summary with this is like Libsyn, they follow a bit of a simpler approach to ID3 tags. However, they do have a little bit more extended information filled out, but overall just some basic details. The next one is one of SP's favorite people in the world, right? Kevin Smith, right?
It's one of those Kevins. So with the Smodcast, there's some main ID3 tags. The first tag is track, which was the episode number for all of the episodes that we pulled. The title was 387 : hit somebody : the audiobook - parts 1 and 2. The next episode title was 391 : Primo Kev, part 1.
Whoa. PT.1. Let's not give PT. Too many keystrokes.
Okay, there you go. And then 397 : AMC - YA, ! Comic Book Men gets canceled. I bet that was a special one for him. So the artist tag was Kevin Smith and Scott Mosier. The album was Smodcast - smodcast.com. That's interesting, with the URL basically in the album. So the album artist was the same as the artist. The year was 2018. The genre was comedy. Okay, we can go with that, I guess. And comment was in which, after 7 seasons and 96 episodes, a TV show ends and a Patreon podcast begins. Guest starring Walt Flanagan, Brian Johnson, Michael Zapek, and Ming Chen. The composer was blank. Now, the extended not only had a copyright of Smodco, Inc., period, but also had encoded by Will Winkins. And those were the ID3 tags that we were able to get from the Smodcast.
The summary is that Smodcast used the lyrics to enter a little bit of a brief description about the episode, and they fill out nearly all of the main information, including the episode number. And the last one that we want to talk about is someone that you might not have heard about before, someone that you might think is a bit of a hack. Well, they both are hacks. You probably yell at your iPod first generation every single week because you're probably out of date if you're listening to this show. Well, that's right. We're talking about Better Podcasting. So how do we do it here on Better Podcasting? We thought we would mention that. First off, yes, the track, we do it very similarly to how Smodcast does it. We just put the episode number in the first field of the track. The title, the way that we do it, here we actually put Better Podcasting, the episode number, and then the title. So we actually put the name Better Podcasting in there. The artist says Better Podcasting. The album says Better Podcasting. And wait for it, the album artist says Better Podcasting. And the reason why is because really, it's a co-show here. So we do like to brand ourselves as Better Podcasting, not just one specific person, not just me, not just SP. So that's why we do things a little differently with ours. And then we do put Better Podcasting all three because we are one entity. That's right. We are legally merged into one entity and physically. We also, with the year, put, of course, the year, which was in the recent episodes, 2018, unless you've time hopped like SP. The genre is podcast, and the comment says available at www.betterpodcasting.com, hosted by Stargate Pioneer and Stephen John Drew. Hint, in the contract, I got more money for him to appear first. That's how it worked. Composer, says Stephen John Drew, brackets Gonna Geek. And that's because I'm the producer and editor of the show. So we agreed that we would put me as the composer. Under the extended field, the subtitle said podcast dedicated to the hobby podcaster. So we use this as our slogan, basically. The copyright says 2018 Better Podcasting. URL says www.betterpodcasting.com. And the encoded by was blank, but I am going to start using that from now on, I think, to just put like Steven's paint drying production services or something like that. The lyrics, we left the lyricist as blank, but we do put our full episode description in the actual lyrics block, which, by the way, is a real pain when you are copying from HTML and you forget to strip the HTML when you copy over and put it in. Then you got to go clear it out.
Control-Shift-V.
I know. Yeah, it's a real pain. And then the embedded covers, maybe we got to step up our game a little bit, but for the last little while, our file size has been hovering around 145 kilobytes with only a 500 by 500 pixel art. So a little bit smaller for those of you who are watching us on your media little individual music app. We'll try to fix that in the future. And the title we left blank. Now, when I look back at this and I kind of compared everybody else, I'll say that the big takeaway that I had is I'll probably increase our album art. But aside from that, I'm pretty comfortable with what we've got in there. We do put a lot more tags in there, and that's just because we are copying and pasting from week to week. So it really doesn't take much extra work to do that. And we'd rather just shove as much information into those ID3 tags as we can so that anybody who might find that information valuable has it. So why exactly do ID3 tags matter enough to dedicate an episode of Better Podcasting to?
So although many players now pull that information from your RSS feed, you never know who or what is going to read those tags. For example, a desktop user that opens up your MP3 at a later date outside of their player client may end up seeing those ID3 tags. And a user might be using an app that flips over to the information within the MP3 when the file is actually downloaded and playing. So in case all a listener has to go on is your MP3 file, that they can get the background information on your show through the ID3 tags. And some people still do actually download your file to their hard drives and keep a record of all the podcasts because, well, that's like a Plex server, right?
And plus, there's the paranoid people like SP, which keeps like all of the data on everybody that he knows.
I have saved a couple of podcasts because I have kept those episodes. And not mine, by the way, other podcasts that I've actually listened to. So there are different ways to encode ID3 tags. Now, the easiest way is if your media host will do auto encoding. I know Libsyn does it, and I know several other hosts do it. But if you are using your own encoding, you can use an ID3 tag encoder. Now, I personally use tag and rename. That was because it was recommended to me by my co-host when I started podcasting back in 2013. And I've seen no reason to move off of it, especially since you can copy and paste without specific fields. You can actually choose the fields that you want to leave out. So that's why I use it. But there's also other ones that Steven uses.
Yeah, I use Tag Scanner. That's the one that I use. Again, same thing. It's worked for me. Tag and Rename, I think, does have a couple more features, but Tag Scanner's worked for me. And then also you could possibly use the iTunes desktop client, but there's a couple of notes with that, by the way, that sometimes by default, when you're entering in information, it doesn't always give you all of the fields we spoke about. I actually found that out the hard way years ago when I first started talking to SP. He's like, why do you not fill this one out? And I'm like, look at this screenshot from iTunes. It's not there. And he's like, what? And I'm like, yeah. So then we went and we just bought myself a free piece of software. In summary, doing the comparison for this episode, it really boils down to, I realized that SP is just working me too hard. Like I said, he was the one that told me about all these extra fields. So really, I blame him. And I think that I'm just going to start slacking more.
I would go ahead and blame myself, but as far as the iTunes desktop goes, I just need to say one more thing, that you cannot copy and paste the ID3 tags over. You actually have to manually enter them anytime. So anyway, yeah, you honestly never used as many details until you met me, and clearly I'm working you too hard. So we need to give you a break, maybe for the rest of the year. Would you think maybe a little bit beyond that?
Starting like right now? I can leave right now?
You can leave whenever you want to. Man.
Okay, sure. Sweet. Sounds great. But no, if you have something that you do with your ID3 tags and you want to tell us, please get in touch with us through any of the ways. You can always find us at facebook.com/betterpodcasting. Head on over to twitter.com/betterpod. Better yet, send us a video or an email if you prefer, but a video to podcast@betterpodcasting.com so that we can hear from you on the show. Again, there's a lot of different ways to do your podcast ID3 tags, but let's go ahead and move into the download.
Welcome to this week's Better Podcasting Download.
Way back in episode 129, we spoke about a WordPress theme. This was made by Second Line Themes, and it was called the Bolden theme. Now, the reason we talked about it on here was because it was a theme geared towards podcast networks. And overall, it had pretty favorable things to say. So much so that I've been really doing a deep dive into using it, if you get my drift. And I've been really happy with what I've been seeing. Now, with that said, I made several suggestions as I started to get deep into this theme, such as there was, we talked about some of the naming with the way that it said when you could subscribe on iTunes. So I made the suggestion that maybe that should be aligned with the modern of Apple Podcasts. Google Podcasts came out, made the suggestion for that. As well, there was a bit of limitation on the show's pages, and it basically showed every single episode when you would go to an individual podcast show page on the website. It would show all of their back episodes on that page, which for some users, they don't want that. They might want to just show the most recent X number of episodes. So I suggested adding that. As well, on the Gonna Geek network, we like to have an email contact available. So I suggested that. Well, guess what? Version 1.0.4 came out, and all of my suggestions were actually implemented in there, plus a whole bunch of other features. And the reason we wanted to dedicate the download to this today was because it seems so often something comes out that's meant for the masses, especially in the way of WordPress, and trying to get real recognition of your feedback or your concept or your suggestion is really hard. And they have been very receptive to everything that I've spoke about. I've had several back and forths, and I'm not going to say the thing specifically, but right now there is a bit of something that I've deemed to be a slight bit of a misstep on their part with the way that some specific form on the site is displayed. I explained the reason behind the benefit to making this change, and they actually said they're going to be making the change, but I don't want to say anything about it because it's not my place to say. But they were very, very receptive, because originally they had said, okay, this is the suggested workaround we have for people like you, but for podcasters, I went, doesn't really work right. So I responded to their response and said, hey, have you considered from this point of view? And they agreed. They agreed for podcasters that it didn't make sense with the suggestion that they were saying. So I really, really am happy to recommend Second Line Themes. They've been so good with their support, really good with their communication. And in fact, when version 1.0.4 came out, they actually specifically responded to me and said, hey, it's out. We implemented some of these features. Here's the list of features, including, and they specifically spelled out the ones that I had suggested. So yes, maybe because obviously we've got a working relationship. They did hear about Better Podcasting. Maybe that is something that they specifically did reach out to me because it's me on Better Podcasting. But I think that it's just so unheard of. I've dealt with a lot of WordPress plugins and themes, and the communication that I've had from these people definitely deserved a callback today in the download.
Yeah, I'm very grateful that we're moving ahead with implementing Second Line Themes, and we will see what it looks like in the future. In the meantime, version control and requirements creep, that's always an issue. So I'm very grateful that they considered your requirements to be at the top of their list for the next version that came out. So hopefully that your next solution will be implemented as well.
Yeah, and if you want to check this out, we'll have links in the show notes. If you want to hear the full review that I did, betterpodcasting.com/129. I have done a lot more with it since then. So if you have any questions, please do get in touch with me. It's Steven@betterpodcasting.com, or tweet me. Just find my information. Ask me your question. I'm happy to answer it. And yeah, they've got a couple other themes I haven't had firsthand experience with, but if you do want to check them out, I believe they have a podcast theme that is not for Podcast Network, but shares some of the same features for an individual podcast. So you can check that out. That's Second Line Themes. But let's go ahead and find out what you had to say this week in podcasting.
Our first Better Podback is from @WinKellyCharles, and she said, @BetterPod, why didn't you bring up Stitcher, which is what I use to listen to you guys on Apple iPhone? I don't use the native app. #problems I didn't have 20 years ago. #advice. #energy. No, we didn't mention Stitcher, but that's a good app to talk about in terms of listening to podcasts. It's ubiquitous. You can get it on the iOS devices. You can get it on Android devices. And it has been steadily a bigger player, not the biggest. That's, of course, Apple Podcasts, but it has been a bigger player in the terms of the single apps out there. It's just when I think the point was we were trying to get across that there was different ways to listen to podcasts, and Google Podcasts was new, and we were trying to differentiate Google Podcasts from everywhere else. But Stitcher is a big app to listen to podcasts. Absolutely.
Plus, you can go ahead and get that on your Amazon Voice Service device for those of you who don't want to download one skill per podcast. We also had an attempt at a hashtag, and we failed miserably. Let's just say that right up front. Failed miserably, but we haven't given up hope. We see the hashtag taking the occasional breath. We know that the hashtag could make a reappearance with your help, because it sounds like a very fun game to have. And we started the hashtag, which I don't know, can you call it a hashtag with only 3 responses? Which was #describe your podcast poorly. So the idea was you describe your podcast poorly. So, of course, we started off by saying international users obsess about your obsession. they also reply to their social media off of social media. That's what we do here on Better Podcasting. Hashtag describe your podcast poorly. We, of course, had the official GonnaGeek.com show chime in as well. I think this was SP's doing. He said, people talk about current things, share personal details about their lives, including conversations they have with a woman they all independently talk to in private, and occasionally battle. Plus truck talk. Describe your podcast poorly.
At Story Behind Pod retweeted or tweeted the hashtag, said somebody invents something, semicolon. Somebody makes money from it, not necessarily the inventor, semicolon. Turns out ancient civilizations probably came up with something comparable. Thanks for listening. Hashtag describe your podcast poorly. Thanks, Emily.
Thank you very much, Emily. I seriously want to see people do this. So come on, let's give it another chance. We may have possibly released this at like the worst time ever. It was the long weekend of July 4th. So absolutely. We want to see you do this. And if not, just email us. How would you describe your podcast poorly? I think it could be a lot of fun to hear your podcast described poorly.
I just have to say that it wasn't me that decided to release this on the 4th of July long weekend. That would come from the Canadian.
It's absolutely true. We also got an email that we wanted to give a special shout out to Zachary Webb, who pointed out that actually on the Gonna Geek website, where when you hit betterpodcasting.com, the Better Podcasting About section had a mislink for the YouTube site. So definitely you want to check your sites over. And it's another of the many, many reasons why I am getting away from the current look of the Gonna Geek site. But thank you very much, Zachary Webb. And if you've ever seen an error like that, we don't bite. We're always happy to take your feedback and let us know exactly where we screwed up, where I screwed up. I'll just say it.
We also got a notification, a message via Slack. Yes, I am on Slack, Stargate Pioneer. It was from Jonathan Bloom, and he said, great stuff about video podcasts. We do a Twitch stream using a remote computer at another location using OBS. I believe that's OBS Studio, Discord, and appear.in for video. All of this is cobbled together. Joy! And I messaged him back and I said, we forgot to talk about appear.in. It's been a long time since we even tried to use it. So it's good that Jonathan says that appear.in is there and it is still kicking and useful for combining video feeds through the OBS and recording through OBS. So that is great. So thank you very much for that, Jonathan.
Absolutely. And I think that he touched on something that we brushed over briefly, which was the idea of cobbling things together. It's a great way to enhance your video element. For example, it's what Chris does on All Things Good Nerdy. It's what FP does on Starling Tribune and Legends of S.H.I.E.L.D. It is basically merging elements together. So like taking Hangouts, letting Hangouts do the switching, and then putting a nice overlay over it. So definitely feel free to cobble together. You're a hobby podcaster. Just be proud you're trying something new.
Something different to stand out amongst the crowd, because according to Apple, there's 550,000 podcasts out there, and I have no idea how many YouTube channels are out there, but it's in the millions, if not billions. So you got to stand out somehow.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about a little bit about how we got screwed by Catbox. This was something that we just stumbled across. You might recall from a recent episode, we talked about Catbox scraping RSS feeds and shoving them on their site. This is a thing. Definitely is a thing. And we know firsthand that it's a thing. Because last week when we released Better Podcasting, we actually noticed that I noticed that all of a sudden Better Podcasting was not showing a new episode under my subscribed Google Podcasts app. That's right. We all know how big of a Google Podcast fan I am. I want to use it. And I went in and there was no episode. Now, I looked further and there was actually no episode since episode 136. SP, what episode is this again?
139.
Yeah. So no episode since 136. And I went, what is going on? And I thought, oh, what have I screwed up? Because obviously I screw everything up. So I clicked on the little hamburger menu and I went view website. And where did it take me to? it took me to Catbox.fm. That's right. Apparently, when I originally searched for Better Podcasting, it subscribed me to the Catbox feed. I don't know how. So I searched again, and this time it's the proper feed.
Wow. I'll tell you, Steven, that whole thing that we talked about Catbox, maybe picking a feed that isn't the correct feed because it's off of the search. We were talking about that the Gonna Geek podcast, one of the search results was actually my Spreaker feed, which should only have one podcast of Gonna Geek on it at any one point in time. Yeah, for this is just another example that Catbox and Google Podcasts are not entirely up to snuff with how podcasting work, and maybe podcasts are going to have to change in order to meet this new paradigm of just searching in the search bar and getting your podcasts to come up via Google search. I don't know, but the way it is today, a new listener could subscribe to your show and not get any further updates.
Yep. And I think it's important to note that while I seem to be getting the right information now from Google Podcasts, because there's not a lot of information on which RSS feed it's indexed, I don't know for sure. It might just be the one that it's indexed is properly showing the website URL. If Catbox hadn't been doing that renaming and that switching of RSS tags that we spoke about, then it probably would still have taken me to the proper Better Podcasting website, and I would have had no idea that people were subscribed to the Catbox one. So the fact that they did that kind of gave this away, but I don't know. At least the new one seems to be right, pointing to the right website, but I just don't know which one is it. And I think there might be some tools that are in progress or coming out or are out, but there's just not been a lot of information about that yet. And from an app perspective, I would really like to also be able to see that a little bit easier. So it's a little frustrating, but it is early in the way of Google Podcasts. But yeah, we got double hit on this. I blame Google Podcasts and Catbox. There you go. We got the worst of the worst.
Indeed. So hopefully things will straighten out in the future. I'm actually worried about this Spreaker thing because I've been using Spreaker. As you know, I've been using Spreaker as the live feed, but that's not where any of the podcast episodes are anymore. So I'm a little bit worried about that. Might have to go back to Mixler. I don't know.
Who knows? But that is going to take us to the end of the show. Before we wrap up, we'll remind you that we're part of the Gonna Geek Network, and we also stream live to Geeks.live, usually on Wednesdays at 5 o'clock p.m. Pacific time. That's 8 o'clock p.m. Eastern. We encourage you to come by the chat room, heckle us, tell us all of the things that are on your mind so that we can steal them and act like they are our own points live during the show. So that's Geeks.live on Wednesdays at 5 o'clock p.m. Pacific, 8 o'clock p.m. Eastern. And while you're over there, please check out some of the other amazing geeky podcasts on GonnaGeekNetwork.com. A lot of really fun episodes of a lot of fun shows there. SP, any closing remarks?
Yeah, we actually got an email while we were recording from fan Johnny Pennington, and he mentioned what a beautiful microphone that Steven is using tonight. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, Steven is back to his first love, the BP40.
Yeah, I really like this mic. I think it's a really good fit for my voice. So I'm always happy to come back to it, but I do like to experiment. I'm like any good college kid.
You're closer to college age than I am. And yeah, even though I like the RE320, I like experimenting with other microphones as well. There's always another microphone out there to try out. Matter of fact, the next trial run that I'm going to do at some point in time in the future is going to go back to the Audio-Technica BP40 and just try that out. So we'll see how that turns out, but I have a hunch that I'll end up back on the RE320.
Awesome. So there you go for episode number 139 of Better Podcasting. I'm Stephen John Drew. Just think about all of that wasted time with the ID3 tags.
And I'm Stargate Pioneer. Say, copy and pasting ID3 tags is worth your time.
Bye.
See ya.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Better Podcasting. We want to hear from you. You can find all of our contact information at betterpodcasting.com. If you like the show, please consider giving us a 5-star review in iTunes. We encourage you to check out all of the other geeky podcasts available at GonnaGeekNetwork.com. This has been a Gonna Geek production. Thanks for listening, and we will see you again next week.